Can Javier Milei overcome resistance to fulfill his free market reform vision for Argentina? Let's find out. Hello, everybody. I'm Graham Walker, coming to you today from the Independent Institute in Oakland, California. Welcome to Independent Outlook, where we try to bring you an independent take on the issues of the day. To talk about Argentina and its new president, Javier Milei, we are joined today by a couple of extraordinary experts who follow Argentine affairs very closely. First of all, let me welcome Alvaro Vargas. Llosa. Welcome, Alvaro.
Thank you for having me.
Great to see you. Many of you may know Alvaro Vargas Llosa because he's, first of all, of course, a senior fellow here at the Independent Institute in our Center on Global Prosperity, and he has been a nationally syndicated columnist with the Washington Post Writers Group, but also he's published books with the Independent Institute. This one's especially pertinent. This one's called Liberty for Latin America, which received the Anthony Fisher International Memorial Award, and also, among other books, this book, Lessons from the Poor, The Triumph of the Entrepreneurial Spirit, very much worth reading. Alvaro Vargas Llosa is a native of Peru, and you may have read him in the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times. I heard him on the BBC World Service or on Univision. He's also written for La Nación in Argentina. We're so grateful to have Alvaro Vargas Llosa with us today. And in addition, we are delighted to have Gabriel Gasave, who is a research fellow at the Independent Institute, also in our Center on Global Prosperity. He's taught economics and law at the Argentina Chamber of Commerce and at the University of Buenos Aires, and also has a chapter in the book I just mentioned. Welcome to you, Gabriel Gasave.
Thank you, Graham.
Gabriel is himself a native of Argentina, so he's especially closely tuned in, and he recently came back from a couple of months in Buenos Aires, so he probably has a sense of things on the ground in Buenos Aires right now. Glad to have you both. Williamson Evers is, of course, my regular partner in these efforts. Bill Evers, nice to see you.
Thank you.
Bill Evers is the director of our Center on Educational Excellence and has been following these things closely. Largely, I'm going to leave this conversation to you, Bill, as you talk with our experts, but maybe you want to give them first question to get the lay of the land.
I think our American viewers don't know enough about Argentina, and they need to know something about the setting, the situation in the country when it was going through the various stages of the presidential election, and how it came to be that a thoroughgoing classical liberal like Javier Milei came to be the winning candidate. There must have been unusual situation in the country. So if you could set forth some of that so our viewers understand the setting, I think it would be helpful.
Thank you. Well, I think you don't get a classical liberal or a self-styled anarcho-capitalist in power in any country, much less in Latin America, unless something major is happening. And what was happening when this took place was a catastrophe, national catastrophe from every point of view, political, economic, institutional, moral. Argentina is seen by the rest of the region and much of the world as a country that was once one of the most prosperous in the world. There's an interesting debate about how prosperous it was, but at the turn of the 20th century, it was certainly one of the 10 most developed countries in the world, a country that attracted millions of migrants from Europe, a country that was clearly part of the
much more prosperous than Canada, for example. Much more prosperous than Canada.
And than many European countries, including Italy. It was more prosperous at the time even than France, and so on. So how did a country like that become a country where half of the population is below the poverty line, where institutions have become a complete joke, where people have become so desperate that they are quitting and they're simply leaving the country? Spain is full of Argentinians. Other Latin American countries have received some Argentinian migration, the United States as well. So the context was one of deep crisis, and that crisis was long in the making, except that the last Peronist government, just before Milei came into government, took the national catastrophe to a new level. Inflation reached something like 200%. When you are at those levels of inflation, it's difficult to give an exact figure, but about 200%. That was huge. The country had ceased growing a long time ago, and of course, you were having a situation in which there was the real possibility that democracy itself would collapse. So I think it's important to understand, Bill, that this did not happen in a vacuum, and it didn't happen because Argentinians suddenly woke up one morning and said, we're Rothbardians. It just didn't happen like that. And one still wonders how many of those who voted for Milei actually voted because they believe in his ideas. I'm sure a number of them have been convinced by now, but many probably voted simply out of complete desperation because there was a guy who stood against everything that had gone on since the return of democracy in the 1980s.
Anything you want to add, Gabriel?
Well,
about the situation?
Yeah, someone said once that there were two curious cases in the world, Japan and Argentina. Japan having nothing, reached everything, and Argentina having everything, lost it, and ended up having nothing. And the Argentines' decadence, I think it started almost 100 years ago, around the 1930s, when nationalistic ideas invade the country. They created a lot of entities, government offices, trying to control exports, imports, the agriculture production, the cattle production. So then, in the middle of the 40s, Perón came in, and since then, Argentines took for granted that regulations, prohibitions, restrictions was the natural way of living. So suddenly, a few years ago, people start thinking that those ideas, those ideologies, don't work anymore, and they start looking for something new. And then it's when Javier Milei came in. He was an economist, an academic. He was in several TV programs, so he became very well known by people. He practically every night in any program you could saw him, and then he was elected president. His personality attracted young people. The disaster that the previous administration made helped him to get more voters. So now we have a chance that we never had before. And my question is that if those people who were attracted by his personality is going to support him when the personality or the character implement measures that affect them. I don't know if it's...
You understand we understand you. Yeah. We understand you. Yeah. Well, I think this is true of a lot of political movements. I mean, how many American voters understand the program exactly of Biden when they elect him, or of Donald Trump when they elect him, or of George W. Bush when they elect him? A number of things figure in what your neighbors are saying, what the barber or hairdresser or the taxi driver is saying. And then it can, as people try and implement the promises that they made or the program that they laid out, some people fall off. We will see. Now, what is the situation in the parliament? Who has he put into his cabinet in terms of political alliances and in terms of technical ability? I guess we could start with that and then go into some of his immediate measures and then what he's trying to get through the parliament.
I think, Bill, that that's going to be a very interesting situation to watch. As has been amply written in the press, he commands a very tiny group of people in Parliament. Only 10% of the Senate and 15% of the lower house. He only has 37 deputies. That is very, very small indeed. So he relies on several other groups. And it remains to be seen what price they will extract from him for their support. That includes the party of former President Macri, Mauricio Macri, a center-right guy who believes in some of the ideas, perhaps it's fair to say many of the ideas that Milei espouses, but when he was in government for circumstances that it would be too lengthy to analyze right now, was not able to implement them. So there's a fair chance that he will and his group will support Milei, except that he only commands a similar number of deputies. So they need a lot more. There's another group, one of the historical Latin American parties, the Radical Civic Union, a party that's more than 100 years old.
I remember when I was in grammar school, I had to learn all the presidents and leaders of the world, and I think Frondizi or somebody like that was the head of Argentina at that time, and he was from that party.
Frondizi, yes.
Yeah, Frondizi. But the party goes back, more than a century.
Right.
So the thing is that party stands for what used to be called in the 60s and 70s desarrollismo, meaning developmentalism, essentially a philosophy that espoused all sorts of government intervention.
Import substitution.
Exactly.
Import substitution.
And interventionism on almost every level. And it's, clearly a party that does not believe in most of Milei's ideas, except that at this point, for political reasons.
But historically, they don't like the Peronists.
No, that's one thing. And the other thing is that politically, they're in a tough spot, so they may have to go along with him, but they will also try to water down many of the reforms. And then there's another group headed by a moderate former Peronist. The Peronists, as you know, have many factions, and
Yes.
they pretty much cover the entire spectrum. You have people on the left, people on the right, moderates, radicals. It's a culture more than a party, more than a movement.
Right.
So some of them
will
have to vote as well.
They had a more pro-business, pro-market leader. I'm not going to something with an M. I don't know how to pronounce
Menem,
it.
but that was but that's not
Menem.
okay. Yeah, he's a former president, but he's not part of this deal.
I see.
And
Okay.
the party I was talking about is headed by a guy called Pichetto, but he's not part of the Menem group right now. He's essentially what you have, Bill. I think what's important to understand is you have an extremely complex situation in which Milei is going to have to do what he hates doing, which is politics. His entire political persona is built around the notion that he's here to do away with politics as usual, to do away with the political class and get things done and liberate people from the stranglehold that the government has on them and that the political class has on them and has had for many years. How do you do that? How do you do that when you have a legislative context of the kind I just described, and with a huge block of Peronists and extreme leftists as well, whose only obsession is to simply not only just stop the reforms, but to get rid of Milei. So it's gonna be very tough. And another scenario, and I'll finish with this, will be the streets. The streets in Argentina have a political significance that goes beyond what they have in other parts of the world. And people who are at this point part of the legislature are also have one foot in the street, as it were, where many other groups are linked to them and allied with them. And they are going to be extremely active and possibly violent.
So the streets include the labor unions.
Very, very important factor.
The streets include
the labor unions.
The streets include and they are Peronist controlled or influenced to a large extent.
Many of them, of course. And so I think it's important to understand that Milei's personality, in many ways, very, very, very Argentinian, very representative of a certain type of Argentinian, will be both an advantage and a disadvantage here. perhaps a disadvantage in the sense that he's very confrontational, of course, and in a scenario in which you need to do politics, this may not help. But at the same time, without the personality that he has, he would not have attracted the millions of young people that he has. He wouldn't have attracted the kind of support that he did. And we have learned from the experience of other countries that engage in major free market reform, whether it be New Zealand in the late 80s and early 90s, whether it be Estonia in the early 90s or Ireland in the late 80s and early 90s. You need to get tough. You need to be very forceful, not only in expressing what you believe, but in pushing things through within a democratic framework. And his personality will help in that respect. So both, I mean, you have both sides of this personality in many ways becoming a factor of both positive and negative in this scenario.
So Gabriel, he put through some executive measures that he could do as president without having to go through the legislature. And then he decided to create an omnibus bill, so a giant bill that covered lots of different topics and packaged them together. So can you say something about the executive actions and then something about the omnibus bill?
Oh, yes, Bill. Well, Milei is trying to implement his reforms through two kind of instruments. One is called a decree of necessity and urgency. Decreto de necesidad y urgencia. Reforming by decree more than 300 laws. It was signed the first week he took power, after taking power. And then he presented a bill that is, today they start the treatment of that bill in the parliament.
So this is going to
started this morning.
Okay, so you need to say what today is, because this is going to go out on the internet a few days from now. So today, what is today?
It's the last day of January.
All right.
It's Wednesday, there's 31.
Can you give a few examples about what he did by decree?
Well,
what kinds of laws? Again, Americans know nothing about these Argentine laws.
He ended up the price control system that was implemented during years in Argentina. Every time that we have an inflation process, they try to camouflage the inflation using price control. So they were implemented several times along the decades, and he finished with that measures. The prices are free now, so that's why we have a prices spike during the last weeks, and people are complaining that the inflation is increasing.
But he warned them during the campaign.
Yeah,
I'm going to do this.
Yeah,
and this is going to be the immediate consequence before everybody adjusts.
But you know, everybody vote for something, but what that something affect him, they react. So what has happened now, that all the interest group that are being affected by the decree and the bill are reacting. So it's going to be hard. The Peronist Party is the worst opposition that you can have when you are in power, because they don't tolerate someone who won them the elections. They created what is called informally the helicopter club. It's because President Fernando de la Rúa, who was from the Radical Party, had to left the Pink House, which is the
White House.
Yeah, the White House is here. The Pink House is in Buenos Aires. He left after resigning in a helicopter. So those guys created the helicopter club, waiting for the president that doesn't belong to the Peronist Party, take the helicopter to leave power. So they are really a bad opposition. You cannot deal with most of them. And as I'm saying, many different sectors of the society being affected by interests that they kept during decades and decades, privileges that they kept during decades are reacting. So the discussion of the law started today, January 31, and the bill is supposedly is some of the provision of the not the bill, the decree are in effect these days, but the courts are stopping many of them. For instance, they declare that the provisions about reform of the labor system it's unconstitutional, so they stop that application of the decree in those areas, and so they are making him difficult to govern. That's the sad point of this.
Yeah. Can I add something, Bill, very quickly?
Certainly.
What's absurd in this scenario is that he is being accused, Milei is being accused of governing or intending to govern like Pinochet or Fujimori in Peru. In other words, of becoming a dictator. It is completely absurd because right now you're having courts actually issuing injunctions against some of his reforms. You're having him water down a few of the reforms in Congress in order to get them passed. You have people, in the streets. You've had a strike just a few days ago. You have a democratic system very much alive in Argentina at this point. Now, it is true that he has issued a decree, but that's under the Constitution of Argentina, that's allowed. In 2006, the Peronist government at the time introduced this reform so that they themselves, and by definition, any government that came after them, could issue decrees of this nature. These are decrees that still have to go through Congress. If both chambers of Congress strike down the decree is simply stopped. So even if that decree that Gabriel just talked about went into force a few weeks ago, it could still be stopped by the Congress if the Congress so decided. So nothing of what is happening at this point in Argentina warrants the accusation or justifies the accusation that has been thrown against Milei in order to try to delegitimize both his government and his reforms.
So let's talk a little bit about some possible delays that are already occurring and some worrisome things. So the delays, the government energy company, the government oil company, he had campaigned that he was going to privatize that along with other government businesses. And they've stepped back from that. I guess there was counter pressure. The idea of dollarization and abolishing the central bank, I don't think that's been taken off the agenda, but it's certainly been pushed into the future. And then there's the prospect of possibly income taxes and additional export taxes coming in. I think we should get some sense of some of this. At the same time, why delay is a worry, because when you try to make a thoroughgoing classical liberal reform, the longer you delay, the longer the interest groups have time to mobilize to slow you down. So anyway, either of you want to discuss some of this?
And maybe we could get Gabriel to talk about dollarization, because, Gabriel, you hosted a big event in Buenos Aires recently on that subject.
Right.
Oh, sure. Well, I want to add something about what Alvaro said about the decree. The decree is approved by a law. The use of the decrees were approved by a law that make it constitutional by Cristina Kirchner when she was a senator, and her husband was in power. So she implemented that to help.
And she later became president, and they are both Peronists, she and her husband.
Exactly. Well, apparently dollarization has been put aside for a while. They tried to stabilize the economy before implementing it. Milei, in several interviews that he had this week, said that he's going to make it, he's going to dollarize the Argentina. And the central bank is trying to recover some reserve that it was empty of them when took power.
Right.
I think that this is my personal opinion, my personal view, as someone that from Argentina suffered inflation my whole life. For instance, when I was going to school and I took the bus to go to the school, I had to ask the driver how much the fee was that morning, because the fees were changing. The price of the ticket changed every day mostly. So I got accustomed to live in inflation. So I don't trust on the peso anymore. Milei promised to put an end to the peso and close the central bank, and I agree with that. The peso doesn't deserve another chance. And because, as Steve Hanke said, is to preserve the peso is like trying to rearrange the chairs on the deck of the Titanic. It's keeping something that is going to be a disaster sooner or later. So I think that the dollarization would be the best legacy that Milei could leave for Argentina, because any other kind of reforms he can implement, if he's successful during his 4 years tenure, could be revoked by a new administration in the future. But once that the people start using the dollar, nobody will take it out from their hands anymore. That's the example that we have is Ecuador. No regime that came after Mahuan, the president who dollarized, was able to take the dollar and implement a new sucre or another kind of currency. So I think that the best Milei could do for Argentina is get the peso out of the scene and implement a dollarization, and maybe in the future Argentinians can look for another kind of currency or monetary system. But that would be great if he can get it.
I think
because
I'm sorry, Gabriel. No, yeah. I was going to maybe for our American audience, we should explain the way the system worked just before Milei came into power, and that makes it difficult for him to dollarize at this point. What was happening was essentially the central bank was funding the government, of course. And so what they did is it was a kind of merry-go-round kind of system. I mean, utterly ridiculous. The central bank printed money and gave it to the government, as they do in so many countries. And then they issued some short-term debt to try and mop up, to try and sterilize some of those pesos. But of course, the only way to convince the banks, the commercial banks, to buy those bonds or that paper was to offer them incredibly surreal interest rates. Now they're at 130%. So, of course, what was happening is the central bank was defeating the whole purpose of this game, because it was having to print more money just to pay interest on the paper that it was issuing in order to remove those pesos from those excess pesos from the market. So anyway, now, of course, Milei has inherited a situation in which the central bank is loaded and loaded and loaded with short-term liabilities and other types of liabilities. So what he feels is that he and the system in general needs to clear some of that, some of those liabilities, some of that debt before it can go into some currency, some alternative currency like the dollar, because otherwise, of course, your liabilities become liabilities denominated in dollars as well, and that could create huge problems. That's one issue. The other issue, of course, as Gabriel was saying, is that the bank reserve that the central bank that Milei inherited had negative reserves, which is, of course, another ridiculous situation. But there is such a thing. There can be such a thing as a central bank with negative reserves. So he's trying to build back some of those reserves, or rather, the central bank is trying to build back some of those reserves, and it's bought about $5 billion in recent days. Now, there's an interesting debate about whether you can go ahead and dollarize despite everything that I just described, or whether you should stabilize things first and clear some of that debt, and then dollarize. But that's a different discussion. The thing is, that's where he's coming from at this point, and that's why he has postponed this measure. But as Gabriel said, he has reiterated many times these past few days that he will go ahead with that when he can. What he has also said is that he doesn't, at this point, he hasn't made a decision whether it'll be straight dollarization or whether it'll be some kind of currency competition whereby people will be able to choose their preferred currency. But I suppose that if that's the case, people will choose dollars as they would in most Latin American countries. In many ways, Argentinians have already chosen the dollar as their currency. Yeah.
He also did rectify some of the foreign exchange situation, and not it was way out of whack with reality, and they made some changes on that.
And you asked about the energy company very quickly.
Yeah, the energy company.
Yeah,
exactly.
Of course,
yeah.
he wants to privatize the energy company along with another 40 state-owned enterprises. But there's strong opposition, not only among the Peronists and the extreme left, but also among some of his allies and the moderates who might vote with him in Congress for his reforms. Because they think that will imperil energy independence. And there's, as you know, across the region, across Latin America, and Argentina is not an exception. There's almost this mystical dimension to energy companies and to oil companies in general. The idea
right.
that the country's sovereignty is imperiled if a foreign company owns your energy concern. But the thing is, when this company was nationalized more than a decade ago, slightly more than a decade ago, the promise was that it would produce a lot more barrels of oil per day than it is producing now, about 4 times more. And not only that, but that some of the bottlenecks that were making transportation of those hydrocarbons so difficult would be sorted out. And right now, that is not the case. So even if they were producing a lot more barrels of oil, they wouldn't be able to transport it because right now you have huge bottlenecks. Why is all of this happening? Because
it reminds me of the energy and electrical companies in South Africa, which are such a disaster and are ruining that country's economy.
Yes.
Well,
so
I realize that he still aspires to doing this nationalization, but he's getting this pushback.
Everything that he has put on hold, he says that he will go ahead and do it eventually, but he's having to backtrack temporarily because, as I said, his problem right now are not the Peronists and the extreme left. I mean, that is only part of the problem. The problem is he needs to persuade enough people from the center-right party of the former President Macri, the Civic Union, and the moderate or ex-Peronists that to support his reforms. And in order for him to persuade them, he's having to water down some of the reforms. But he says he believes in them, and that he will go ahead with them later on.
So he put some of the more friendly, technically skilled people and politicians from these other parties into his cabinet. And he got so there were several, Argentina has a staged presidential election system, and Patricia, I'm not sure how to pronounce. Yes,
Patricia
okay, so
Bullrich.
She came to support him in later rounds, and her people are helping him in some of these cabinet positions, and I guess they must be helping him some in parliament too.
Something, Bill, that I would like to add is that the more severe the crisis is, the easier it is to implement huge reforms. So regarding dollarization, if he stabilizes the economy, many people will say, well, it's everything is okay now. Why do we need the dollar? We can continue using the peso. So that's a dilemma that exists in a society like the Argentinian one.
Right. I agree. It's a political and sociological phenomenon that you can, if you see clearly the horrible things that are going on and you see an alternative, but if things are plugging along, it doesn't seem so necessary to take a drastic step. I wonder if our American viewers, our listeners, are fascinated by Pope Francis being an Argentine. and what kind of social and political views he might have imported into his term in the papacy, and how that might go into the sort of history of the political culture in Argentina.
Shall I go ahead, or do you want to go ahead, Gabriel?
Sure.
Okay. I think that, this is a very interesting situation. When he became Pope, there was a huge question mark. Would he be a progressive, so to speak, quote unquote, kind of Pope? And if so, what would be his relationship like with his home country? And that relationship became very annoying to the non-Peronists, because he became very, very close to Cristina Kirchner and to the Kirchner government in general. That government went on from 2003 for the next 12 years.
And just to remind our Americans, they were a Peronist government. The two Kirchners.
Yeah, exactly.
Continue.
So that went on from 2003 to 2015, and during that time, he became extremely close to Kirchnerismo. And that annoyed the opposition enormously, because at the time, not only was Kirchner implementing some of these very interventionist and socialist type reforms that have created the enormous mess that has been inherited, that was first inherited by Macri, and then after the following government, which was another Peronist government, by Milei. But it was also a very authoritarian government. It was manipulating the institutions of democracy in such a way that it was trying to create a very authoritarian type of environment in which presidential power clearly became disproportionate. And nevertheless, Pope Francis was very, very close, very supportive of that government. So when Macri came into power, it was thought that perhaps the Pope would go for some kind of rapprochement with him, because he must have been conscious at the time of the disaster that Macri inherited. But he did not. He was very distant from that government, and he made it known that he wanted to keep a distance. He treated Macri and his government very coldly. So now you have an even more interesting situation, which is that, of course, Pope Francis doesn't believe in any of what Milei is doing. Plus, Milei has been extremely critical of the Pope, and libertarians in general in Argentina have been very critical of the Pope in the past. But now Milei is having, of course, to establish some kind of dialogue with him, and he's about to go on a trip to Italy and Israel, and he will be visiting the Vatican in order to try and establish some kind of ongoing dialogue with him, even though these two people hate each other's guts and stand for extremely, extremely incompatible philosophy. So it'll be very interesting to watch. I don't know how Gabriel sees that dynamic, but I see it from outside like something to watch, because the Pope is a political factor in Argentina, whether you like it or not.
Well, Milei is planning to visit him the first weeks in February, and start talking and trying to leave behind disagreements. But what I see that the influence of the Pope in Argentina lately has been very, very scarce. I don't know.
Attenuated, yeah.
Yeah, people that don't care much about what he says or what about his opinions. Basically, people who is against the ideologies that sometimes the Pope seems to support, like going to Cuba or with dealing with Maduro in Venezuela or other regimes, make some noise. But in general, the Pope is not a an issue lately in the country. People don't care. I think that a visit, if he could visit the country, would be a huge event, and many religious people will be so happy of having the Pope in Argentina. But in daily basis, it doesn't affect much what he says or what he thinks. Fortunately,
I think, I mean, although that's very true, I still think that he will become an important player, but an indirect player, so to speak, eventually. Obviously, it's too soon for him to start boycotting Milei. There's also a problem. Of course, the Pope has to protect his church, and his church has been getting some tough opposition from the evangelicals and the Protestants in general in Latin America in recent decades. That's another discussion for another day. But
it's an amazing.
Yeah, he can
amazing growth of evangelical Protestants in Latin America that
he can
generally Americans are not aware of. But it's huge,
and it's beginning to happen in Africa too. So those are the two most important reserves of Catholicism, if you want, at this point. So he has to be very careful about what he does in Latin America if he doesn't want to create an even weaker position for the church. At the same time, he's a very political pope, like many of them. He's also quite an ideological pope, and he's also somebody who we know stands for the opposite of what Milei believes. So I wouldn't put it beyond him if his health permits. A little later on, if he sees that Milei is having trouble pushing through some of his reforms, and he eventually becomes unpopular or something like that, in a different kind of context, in other words, from today's, I wouldn't put it beyond him to start creating trouble indirectly in Argentina. You can never know what he will do.
So I'm wondering if we could maybe conclude by putting Argentina's political and economic situation and Milei's appearance on the scene in the context of the entire region of Latin America, and we could conclude with that. This has been a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion. So I think if we, talked about Peru and Ecuador and Colombia, Chile and Brazil and some of these other things, and that would be a fruitful way to wrap it up.
I think we've never seen such a diversity of regimes and political leanings in government in Latin America. It's really quite astounding. But in general, I would say that until very recently, we had a predominant left-wing bent in the region, various forms of left-wing populism, with many different nuances. These were very different types of governments in many respects, but generally speaking, that's what you had. But now we're seeing the beginning of a reaction. We've seen a reaction in Peru, where the former vice president of a president who was a Marxist and who tried to engineer a self-coup, betrayed him, became president, constitutional, I should say, and is now hated by the left and is seen as a right-wing president, even though she really isn't a right-wing president at all. But that's the way she's perceived. You have Milei, of course, is in and of itself a form of reaction against left-wing populism in the region. The president of Colombia, a former guerrilla guy, who is an outright demagogue, has become hugely unpopular, and there's been a major reaction from many quarters in Colombia. And in Chile, of course, we recently saw the various movements or currents of the left who were trying to change the constitution and frame a new constitution very much in line with their ideas, failed to do so because the same middle class that had supported them between 2019 and 2021-22 suddenly decided that they had gone too far and that they were imperiling the Chilean model, a model with which those very same voters were very frustrated just a couple of years ago. So a very surreal type of scenario. And then you have what's even more surreal, a populist
Brazil.
Brazil, where Lula returned to power, one of the most corrupt presidents we have had in Latin America in a long time, and that's saying a lot if you know the region. And then we have Mexico. I mean, Mexico is fascinating. You have a populist guy with a left-wing discourse, but who is more careful with the fiscal purse and with the central bank than many other types of left-wing populists we have had and have today in Latin America. So that
sometimes Bolivia can be like that too.
Well,
you can have,
it wasn't a Morales,
a left-wing populist, and then you could have some care on the fiscal and banking side,
and attracted foreign capital. And now that has changed in Bolivia somewhat. It's the situation there is quite terrible. But yes, until recently, that's what you had. So anyway, in this scenario, we have Milei, whom everybody is watching. His enemies, people like Maduro in Venezuela, because they are desperate for him to fail. Maduro is facing a presidential election this year. He's trying to avoid it, but eventually he will have to call it. And his antagonist is a woman, a lady, Maria Corina Machado, whose ideas are very much the same ideas that Milei espouses, except that Maria Corina, is more elegant in her forms, in her demeanor. But she believes in many of the things that Milei believes. So Maduro is watching very carefully.
She combs her hair.
Yes, she combs her hair.
She combs her hair.
Yeah, and so Maduro has a stake in what's happening in Argentina for that reason. And at the same time, in countries like Peru, in countries like Paraguay, very recently, we've seen groups beginning to become very much alive on the libertarian side. People who were until recently, removed from politics, thinking that there was no way that somebody who stands for libertarian ideas could make an inroad within the political system, and just sticking to the to academics, so to speak, or to academia, now beginning to believe that there's a future for them in politics as well. So they're watching very carefully what's happening with Milei. He has become clearly a focal point, somebody whom everybody is watching, both for the right reasons and the wrong reasons.
I can't resist tossing another final question in here, Bill. Excuse me, but
certainly.
In mid-January 2024, Javier Milei went to Davos, of all places, and gave a speech that seemed to turn the place upside down. Gabriel, did you listen to his speech, and why was that speech such a big deal?
Well, because he went there to tell people something that they didn't want to listen to, and he made an ideological speech instead of practical, of pragmatic, and it was a huge bomb in the band. What he said, defending capitalism, defending entrepreneurs and businessmen as heroes, and warning the world that we are in danger because socialist and collectivist ideas are taking place everywhere, and our freedoms are getting weaker, and well, we lost many of those freedoms in fact. So it was a huge event and very provocative. I think that his purpose was to provoke those guys in the audience that morning in Davos.
It was great to hear Israel Kirzner and the discovery process of entrepreneurs explained to the Davos crowd. That's
exactly.
Just wonderful. Yeah. Okay, I think maybe we can wrap this up, Graham.
That's great. I mean, this has been so fascinating. I would like to give our two experts one last quick shot. will Javier Milei succeed? I'm going to ask you both, starting with Alvaro.
I very much hope so. I think it will transform Argentina in many ways, and he will go down in history as one of the great reformers of the 21st century if he does. But at this point, the forces acting against him are so powerful that remains an open question. If anybody can do it, it's him, precisely because of that personality that we've talked about. But even so, I think it's an extremely, extremely tough call to make at this point.
Gabriel Gasave, will Javier Milei succeed?
Well, I thought that he already succeed because he raised issues that were in discussion for a long time. So free market, the regulation, privatization weren't on the table for decades, since the 90s. So in that way, he won. Now I'm moderate optimist about what he could be able to achieve, because, as I said, the Peronists is a huge movement, and as an opposition, they are not always very, very nice, or never have been very nice, and moderate. So, as Alvaro said, it's a tough task, and I wish for the luck of Argentina that he could be successful in the near future. And dollarize the Argentina, please.
Yeah, that you say that's a crucial
Gabriel
step.
Has, well, I should say, Graham, that Gabriel has been fighting for this for a long time, so I can see why he would want that to happen sooner rather than later, because he's right. If this doesn't happen soon, it'll be postponed and postponed and postponed, and it may never happen. So he's right about that.
Okay, President Milei, if you're listening. Okay, we're going to pay attention to this, and if you don't mind, gentlemen, we are going to return and ask you to give some more insight, maybe in the near future as events unroll. I would like to point out that for our listeners and viewers today, that you can go to our website, independent.org, for the Independent Institute, and find some very interesting material written by both of our experts today. For example, I'm looking at this piece that you wrote, Gabriel, called Javier Milei's Chainsaw Plan and the 5 Principles of Oppression, which were developed by Alvaro. And Alvaro himself has a piece up on our website right now called Javier Milei's Free Market Revolution. I would encourage everyone to tune in to our website to keep updated on our analyses of this and other matters at independent.org. And thanking everyone for joining us, tuning in. Thank you especially to Bill Evers for leading our conversation. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. And
to Alvaro Vargas Llosa and Gabriel Gasave, muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias.
See you all next time.